Okay. 1 Corinthians. This is probably going to be the longest slideshow you'll see during this course. I put a lot of stuff on there because I think it's good for us to look at. But in the future, I'm going to try to trim it down to where it's just important stuff that we may need to illustrate what Paul was trying to say. Paul tends to have a tendency to confuse you when he says things, and you have to kind of sit back and try to figure out what he was trying to say. And I got to thinking about that the other day. You know, Peter said that Paul was sometimes hard to understand, and I got to thinking about that. Why did our Lord allow his will to be revealed in such a way that would cause us to have to go and meditate on it and dig around in it and think about it? And that's probably the good reason why he did, because if it was easy to understand, people would not probably spend as much time studying the Word as they should. And as you read Paul's letters and you go back through them over the years and begin to reread them and rethink them and meditate on them, sometimes new ideas and new thoughts come out, and you'll be surprised at what Paul was actually saying. So what we're going to be doing in this class, if you haven't already, if you want the teacher's notes, there's the link to it, and I'll have that up on our opening screens during the next 3 months. Also, the notes will be a combination of what you'll find in your book versus some of the stuff that I'll throw in there that I think is important for us to look at. So we may not always follow the book exactly. We'll probably kind of cherry pick some of the main points out to get us through the course, and I think in a manner which is beneficial for us. So anyway, before we get started, let me make sure this thing is going to work. He was giving me a fit a while ago. Okay. Let's take a look at what we're going to be doing this evening. First of all, we're going to be looking at class resources, and I thought I was going to have this up here at one thing. Then we're going to be looking at some translation traps that we need to be aware of. Then we're going to be looking at the establishment of the church and then the city of Corinth and the cultural influences that it's had, and it's noted for its wickedness, and how the Lord established his church in such an environment. And we'll talk more about the city of Corinth in a few moments. Then we'll look at the circumstances that prompted Paul to write this letter, and then the first 9 verses, and then we'll come to a conclusion about the lesson itself. So that's kind of what we're going to be going through this evening. So looking at class resources, I try to do this in case if you're interested or in case you want it, or there may be some interesting things out there that you need if you have the time to go and read them. So what I've done is I've accumulated all these things, I've put it on our website, and you can access it if you so wish. So if you want to do that, then I'll have a direct link to that page in our weekly newsletter. But also you can go to the website, which is the North Main Church of Christ, click on video teaching, then video Bible classes in 1 Corinthians, and it'll bring it up to you. Now I know you can't read this, but this is what the page will look like. And once you get there, the first thing you'll see at the top is the resource materials, and that'll take you to another page. But I'll also have the YouTube videos lined up here. I'll have the name of them. We'll have access to the notes, PowerPoint slides if you want them, and the date that we did it. And also I put one on here that I did back in 2023 on 1 Corinthians 7:36 through 38 that I thought was fairly interesting. So that's the page that you'll see. If you'll click on the commentaries and books, it'll take you to this page. And I know you can't see this, but I'll kind of explain it to you. The first section up here are commentaries. And I've only got 3 listed. I've got one by David Liskin and one by Brad Price. Now Brad Price, that's a good one. It's about 900 pages long, but it's a good one. And then I found another one that I thought was interesting. It was called The Church and the Pagan Society, written by Ebert. And he was a Mennonite. And he takes a rather conservative approach, but he has some good ideas. And then I put a book on here. It's called Not Under Bondage by James D. Bells. Now this is a book you need to be aware of and you need to be cautious with, because James D. Bells in this book takes the the standpoint in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that if an unbeliever leaves a believing spouse for any reason, then the believing spouse is free to remarry and not be guilty of adultery. And that's a stance that he took. So if you read this book, Not Under Bondage, then you need to come down here to this article written by Mike Willis. It's a Truth Magazine article called Not Under Bondage. And just 2 or 3 pages, he will pretty much put to rest what you find in that book. In fact, that's in your handout that I gave you earlier. So you've got that little paper handout, that's the article that's in there. Then I've got some other articles. I think first century cultural backgrounds in Greco-Roman Empire. I think that's the one that I put in the handout. But there's another one. It's called The Nuptial Ceremony of Ancient Greece and the Articulation of Male Control Through Ritual. If you got time to read that, that's another good one. And then The Legal Rules of Incest in the Ancient Near East. That's a long one, but it kind of gives you an idea how the old people back then viewed incest under their laws and their customs. Then, miscellaneous, I've got the letter that was written by Clement of Rome, the first epistle to the Corinthians. Now, why I put that in there is that he wrote this particular letter about 50, 60 years after Paul wrote the first letter to Corinthians. And you will see the similar problems beginning to creep back into the church, or at least prevalent in the church. So that tells me that a generation has passed and another generation is now on the scene, and they're experiencing pretty much the same problems. And all I can say is that their parents didn't teach the children correctly, and the influence of the city continued to make its mark upon the people. But also another thing that's interesting about this particular letter is that you begin to see some of the first elements of the role of authority that God has established in the church beginning to disintegrate. You begin to see people beginning to take authority positions that is not found in the Bible. Then we have the class handbook, and then another link back to the videos. So this is what you have here. Good stuff if you've got time to read it. If you don't, it'll be there forever until the website goes away. Now, another thing I want to talk about is translation traps. And all of these is in chapter 7 of this letter. And the reason why I say translation traps is because modern day translations look at particular verses and you will get different ideas from them. And in this particular class that we've got, I'm sure there's several different kinds of translations being used. And you may have one, and when you're reading through it, you say, hey, Ted, that's not what my Bible says. It says something totally different. Well, let's just take a look at a few of them. First one is 1 Corinthians 7 verse 15. The believer leaves an unbeliever. Now, there are some translations, the NIV, the NLT, Common Standard Bible, the NET, and CEV, suggest that the believer is loosed from the marriage bond if an unbeliever leaves a believer, suggesting that they can remarry. Now, what that does is it ignores the marriage bond is for life that we found in Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and verse 3. Then we have translations that says that when an unbeliever leaves a believer, the believer is not enslaved to keep the marriage together. In other words, if there's nothing you can do to keep the marriage together, you're not to forsake your standing with God. Let him depart. You are to be considerate of the marriage bond is still binding. And this is found in American Standard, King James Version, New King James, New American Standard, and the ESV and the ERV. So different translations give you different ideas. And the more liberal translations will actually tell you that God wants you to be happy, let him depart, and go be married again. So be it. So we have to be careful about some of these translations in that respect. And we'll talk maybe some more about this as we get through the letter. So this supports the marriage bond is for life, Romans chapter 7. Now another one, and we've talked about this I think before, I'm not sure if it was a class situation or if we talked about it during a sermon. The virgin under discussion is a man's daughter, as is suggested by the American Standard, King James Version, New King James, New American Standard. It's also said that he's a man's betrothed, English Standard Version, NIV. The man's fiance, the NLT, CSB, CEB, and the NET. And then our friends in our Jehovah's Witness group, their New World Translation says it's referring to the man himself. Now, when you look at these different translations, you're going to see this, and you're going to see various scenarios of the whole situation. I mean, it's a jumbled mess when you start looking at modern translations. And if you remember from our class that we had earlier, a man's betrothed is a man that has been married, but this marriage has not been consummated. Whereas a man's fiance is a man, well, the woman has been promised to a man, but the marriage bond has not been made. So, there's different, translation says different things, so we have to be aware of this as we go through this lesson. And then, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39, a widow can remarry with this condition, only in the Lord, or that is by observing God's laws. American Standard Version, King James Version, New King James, these versions will say this, only in the Lord. But there are some translations that says he must be a Christian, or he must be a believer. And the NIV, the CEV, the NET are some of that I found that says this. So there's a difference of interpretation here, or translation here rather, and both of these are different, because one says you can only marry if the spouse is a Christian, whereas the other one says you can only marry only in the Lord. So we'll be looking at that as we go through. So just be aware that modern day translations don't always get things right, and they will confuse you to no end if you start looking at these in a parallel situation. So, as we introduce this particular lesson, chapter 1, let's take a look at what we're going to be going through. First of all, this is the only epistle in the New Testament that shows us what was actually happening inside of a New Testament congregation. And this is a wealth of information. Now, when you think about where Corinth was at, the people that made up the church, the people that made up the society, was no different from the churches in Ephesus and Galatia and the other Colossae and other places. So what we see experienced here in 1 Corinthians, no doubt they were having to deal with in all the other congregations as well. But this is the only letter that we have that shows us these problems. So by studying these problems, we can possibly avoid many of the same problems today within our own congregation, because what they were going through, we see today as well. So the establishment of the church and or at least the lesson topics that we'll look at this evening from now on, is the establishment of the church and why Paul wrote this letter, the occasion of this letter being written, the city of Corinth itself, some of the circumstances that prompted this letter, and then finally we'll look at the first 9 verses, which we probably won't have time. So, establishment of the church. This is probably stuff that we've known, and we just kind of go over it rather quickly. It was established by Paul around 52 AD on the second missionary journey. You can see this in Acts chapter 18 and verse 19. And as we look at 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 15, he calls them his father. And this is an interesting thing, because when Paul first comes to Corinth, he aligns himself with Aquila and Priscilla because they were all tent makers. Now, if Aquila and Priscilla were already there and they were Christians, did they constitute the establishment of the church? Some commentators say they were Christians before Paul was there in Corinth, and so they were probably the ones that established the church. But when you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 15, Paul asserts parental rights over this particular congregation. In other words, they were his children. So that kind of tells me that when Paul came into Corinth, there's a good chance that Aquila and Priscilla were not Christians at that time, and that they were probably among his first converts and became his workers with him in establishing that particular church. So depending on who you talk to and what they say, we have to assume that Paul was the person that established this congregation. He stayed there about a year and a half, and he revisited them on his third missionary journey. Now, one of the most notable events that we read about, and I think this is kind of interesting when you think about it, Acts chapter 18 and verse 8 says that Crispus was a chief ruler of the synagogue, and was probably Paul's most notable convert. At least he was one that kind of stands out. And it kind of makes sense. If you get the chief ruler to convert, he has a good chance of converting a lot of the Jews within the synagogue, because he's a ruler and he has the ability to teach those people at that particular time what the truth was. When he was converted, he stepped down. Sosthenes stepped up into his place. Now, we're also told in Acts chapter 18 that the Jews rose up against Paul, and Gallio, the proconsul, refused to take action against the Jews' claim that Paul needed to be judged by him, and refused to do anything because he said if it was a matter of Roman law, or it was a situation like they considered Rome and its needs, I'll listen to it. But since it's your religion, just get out of here. I don't have time for this. So he threw him out of the court, and because of this, the Greeks beat Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue. Now, kind of made me think about this situation here. If the Jews were the one that brought this before the Roman council, proconsul, and he didn't do anything about it, why did the Greeks beat Sosthenes? And I kind of mulled this around a little bit, and I said, this probably the same situation that happened here is what will happen in Ephesus. When Demetrius the silversmith was beginning to lose money because people were being converted to Christianity, they weren't buying his idols and his other little trinkets that were being used, and he was losing money, as well as some of the other silversmiths. So they drug Paul out, and they were fixing to have a big to-do with him. Now, I'm thinking the same situation happened here. When people were being converted, and Christ did tell Paul that he had much people in this city, that they were being converted. The silversmiths were beginning to lose their trade for their idols to Aphrodite and Apollos and all the other idol temples that were there. And possibly those that were drunkards weren't visiting the taverns, and so the taverns were beginning to lose money. So you see, as people were being converted to Christianity, the vices of the city were beginning to suffer. So it probably got to the point where these people got together and said to the chief ruler of the synagogue, Sosthenes, said, listen, Paul's a Jew. He's one of your people. You rein this guy in and make him stop what he's doing. So the Jews probably thinking, probably the best way to do this is bring him up before the Roman proconsul and let him, throw Paul in prison. This will probably stop the thing. Well, instead, he threw it out of his court. And when the Greeks didn't see that they were going to get the retribution they wanted, they took it out on Sosthenes. So that's the kind of a scenario that I see, because it's a similar one that we see happening in Ephesus. So when you read that, why did the Greeks beat Sosthenes? This is the only way I can see that happening. Now, this is where it happened. And I had the pleasure of visiting Corinth, and I took this picture. And this is where Gallio would probably have sat, and this is where Paul would have stood. And this is all that really remains of the floor of the place that he was at. And I marveled at this because I thought, I'm standing in a place, and I could have actually went up there and stood in that particular spot. I was thinking, I'm standing in a place where Paul was facing people that wanted to harm him, and he was fixing to give defense for himself. But to be so close to a place that I knew that Paul stood was just absolutely amazing. So the city itself was located in the main route from travel between east and west. It was kind of between Turkey and Italy. And traffic passed through Corinth, and it crossed by across the isthmus, so it was a small piece of land. It was a lot easier to do that than to try to travel around the peninsula and its dangerous waters. So what happened is the smaller ships would pull up there, they would unload their cargo, they'd put the ships on rails, and then pull these things across, get them on the other side, and reload them. And while that was happening, all the sailors was getting off these ships, and they were going to Corinth and having a good time. So it's kind of like when a Navy ship pulls into port and the sailors get off, what do? They go out and have a good time, right, Will?
Yeah.
And when I say a good time, what I'm saying is that they take advantage of every vice that they can think of. Now, this is where it's actually, well, a little bit closer to the picture there. But this is this particular point. This is where the ships would have went across, and this is the old city of Corinth, and this is the Acro Corinth. This was where the Temple of Venus was, and the home of 1,000 prostitutes. Now, this is all that remains of that road that traveled across that isthmus. These little bit of water back here, that's the canal that they dug to connect one side of the sea to the other. And that's a little bit better shot of it. And you can see the grooves that were in the road, and this is where they were excavating it again, and there's a little piece of that road right there. So this road is probably was bigger than what you were actually thinking that it is. But this is all that remains of it today. And you see that it was well worn from constant use. Now, the population of the city is about 400,000. To kind of give you a comparative size, Beaumont is 113,000 people. So it's probably 3 times bigger than Beaumont. Now, when I was at Corinth, the excavated part of the city, there's no way it could have held 400,000 people. So what we saw had been excavated is just a minor part of the whole city itself. So it was quite extensive. It abounded in studios, workshops, schools of philosophy, and also it was probably about the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire. And a lot of people said it was called the Light of Greece before the Romans destroyed it. They had a lot of philosophers there, and a lot of wisdom was going back and forth, and it just, they had everything. But it was also noted for its wickedness. Vices were brought from sailors from all over the part of the world. So when the sailors pulled in, they brought their ways with them. And Corinth was the recipient of their ways, and then probably the people latched on to them as they saw fit. The word Corinth was also a synonym for wealth, luxury, drunkenness, immorality, and self-indulgence. And this city had all of that. Now, when you have a place where people are wealthy and they're comfortable, they have luxury, they have everything they need in life to make themselves self-sufficient, then they start seeking the pleasures that it brings. That is the drunkenness, the immorality, and self-indulgence, and all of these things. And that's why a lot of people say that when you have poverty in a country, you have a more religious group of people than you do one that is wealthy. So Corinth became a byword for evil and immoral living. So if a person was saying, this guy's worse as a Corinthian, they knew exactly what you were talking about. It's kind of like the stigma that our town has had to face over the years. When you told them where you were from, people knew exactly what you were talking about. And it took us a long time to overcome that, and I don't know if we've ever have overcome that. But anyway, people can be identified by the town in which they lived in, and this was what was happening there. The Temple of Venus, or Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was there. The temple had 1,000 priestesses. They were promoting prostitution in the name of their religion. And I threw this in here. This is another picture I took. And this is some of the rubble from the city of Corinth itself. There's not a whole lot standing. It's just bits and pieces all over the place. But the temple was right up here, the Acro Corinth. And you can't see it too well, but it's right up there. Now, this picture kind of brings it into perspective. Before it was made into a fort back in, many years after it was destroyed, this was where the 1,000 priestesses lived up there, and they would come down in the city and ply their trade. And it's kind of like Jesus said that, you know, take a light, put it on a hill so everyone can see it. Well, they took their temple of prostitution and put it on a hill, and everybody in the city could look up to it and knew exactly what was going on. That was a constant reminder of what sin and lasciviousness was all about. Now, I made a trip up there, and let me tell you something. I've climbed a lot of stuff in the last few years, but that was probably one of the hardest climbs I made in this trip. But anyway, I don't think we made it all the way to the top. We just kind of looked at some of the things up there. But after the city was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, I think it was later turned into a fortress and fortified with the army. Now, as we look in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, we see the wickedness in which these people lived in. Paul says, do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, or homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revelers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God, and such were some of you. Now, this was a problem that Paul had to overcome when he was establishing the church there. Because all of these people, all of their lives was exposed to all of these things. And when a person becomes a Christian, it's not like a light switch, it just all ends. They know that they have got to stop, and now the time becomes that they have to try to overcome all of these things. It's kind of like a drug addict, you know, you just don't go cold turkey, you try to wean them off of it. So Paul had the problem of these people falling back into their old ways. Now, we can see why so many regarded the preaching of the gospel as foolishness, as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 18 and verse 26. And we can also see why Paul would have been in weakness, fear, and trembling, as he states in the second chapter, verses 1 through 5. Now, Paul came into the city. He made the statement in chapter 2. He says, I was with you in weakness, fear, and in much trembling. Now, Paul was a preacher of the gospel, establishing a church, and here was the people that he was working amongst. Idolaters, prostitutes, homosexuals, drunks, revelers, extortioners. The people that, you know what extortioners are? Those are people that will try to get you to do anything, that will blackmail you into doing things or blackmail you into money, people that will probably physically harm you. And Christ comes to Paul, as we see in Acts chapter 18, and tells him, don't be afraid that no one is going to harm you. I think when he says, I'm in much trembling and fear among you, he feared for his life because he was working among these people, and it was very easily to get knocked around if he was trying to convert some of these people to Christianity and they didn't want to be messed with. So he had his problems, not only from the field in which he was working in, but those that had been converted, trying to keep them from going back that way. Now the city shows it was the church was established in a wicked city. Now this city shows us the abounding grace of God. The ability to build a church in such an environment and establish it so that even though they had their problems, they were still trying to work out the solution to their problems. It also shows us that it proves the power of the gospel, that it has the ability to overcome everything that we just read in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 to make these people a better people. It overcame the strongest and most polluted passions of their nature. And when you read chapter 6, those few verses, you see the polluted nature in which they came out of. And Paul was able through the gospel, and God's gospel was able to pull these people out from that position. Now, the circumstances that prompted this letter. It was written around 55, 56 AD, about 3 years after Paul established it. It was written while he was at Ephesus. And he made and it's evident that he made contact with the church, because when people came, he said, it's been reported unto me by the house of Chloe. People were, people come in and say, how you doing? How's the church in Corinth? How are the people there? And we do that here too. When we have people come in, how's the church in that particular city in which you're in? By exchanging letters. And we know this because the Corinthians had wrote him a letter wanting some answers to their problems. So Paul had contact with the church, not only in Corinth, but in all the churches in which he established. And when he said that, I'm persecuted daily, and yet I still have the care of all the churches weighing upon me to have to deal with. So when we look at it, the problems of a single congregation, think about trying to keep all of the congregations on the same footing. Paul had a tremendous, tremendous work laid out for him. So the problems in Corinth reflect how the church is affected by its culture. We see the problems, we can see the culture, and we can understand why the problems were happening. That's why I kind of gave you these some of this preparatory material about how women were treated in the first century. This is going to be important as we go through some of these chapters that deal with women and marriage and what have you, because it shows you the culture that was back then versus what we have today. A lot of times we read the Bible and we mentally think today's culture, but it was quite different back then. And we need to think how that culture existed so that we can understand Paul's letters. He now writes back to encourage people and to admonish them with the gospel and with the gospel. So what prompted this letter? These, 8 or 9 things here. And I think Harkrider did a good job at laying them out. They had become factious and following men. They were proud and intolerant of incest. They were taking one another to civil courts to settle their matters. They had questions about marriage because they didn't understand what the truth was. You stop and think about it, with a temple of whoredom that they had to look at every day, and they're coming down in the city and they were suing that fornication and these sort of things was considered a normal way of life. They had problems with understanding of marriage. Eating meats offered to idols. The Lord's Supper became a secular banquet. They were instruction regarding spiritual gifts. They had problems with that. They were they were beginning to weigh which gift was better than the other, and they were striving to get what they thought was best so they could be impressive to someone. And then they were denying the resurrection of the dead. So Paul had quite a bit of teaching to try to correct. So with that said, this chart was in your handout, and it's a good chart. And if you haven't taken the time to look at it, let's take just a moment here. We're going to run out of time and look at it. Looks like verses 1 through 9 are going to have to wait till we come back. And be sure to tell Ronnie he's on for Sunday. I kind of left him up because I didn't know what was going to happen. Ronnie will be teaching the class Sunday, and I'll come back Wednesday night. So this particular letter, the focus of it is that the first chapter or so answers to report of division, answer to report of fornication and litigation, and then answers to the letters to the questions. So what Paul had to deal with first was to take care of their problems and to correct them and get them all back onto one footing before he could answer any questions. Once he got that straight and squared away, then he could go into the questions in which they answered. Now the problems that they had, reported divisions, the reasons for these divisions, incest, litigation, and immorality. This was the problems that they were experiencing. These were divisions in the church. The first couple of things, these were the cause of the divisions in the church, and then we see the disorders in the church. They were divided, they had problems among themselves. And then the last, from chapter 7 on out through 16, he takes care of the difficulties within the church, those things that they had written about. Marriage, offerings to idols, public worship, resurrection, and then finally just some comments on the collection for Jerusalem and his closing comments. So when we look at these particular chapters 1 verses 1 through 18 is Paul's concern for the brethren by being divided. This was a big concern for him. He had to get these people united again. Then he had to take care of the disorders in the church that they were engaged in. So if you get them united, take care of their disorders, and get them back on the right track, then we can start taking care of the teaching that they needed on these difficulties. Concern, condemnation, and counsel. And this was written in Ephesus, and the time is about 56 AD. Might be a good stopping place, because I'm not sure how much further we're going to go. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, well, let's just kind of venture off into it. The greeting, first two verses, Paul addresses the church about he was the writer, Sosthenes was with him, and then he has the praise and commendation in verses 3 through 9. So, when we look at verse 1 and verses 2, Paul says that he was called to be an apostle of Christ. Now, being called means that Jesus specifically called him. He was not an apostle that was self-made. He just didn't stand up and say, well, I'm going to be an apostle of Christ. No, he was called to be an apostle. It was not made by himself, or nobody appointed him to that position, but it was by Jesus Christ through the will of God. And the second person that was with him was Sosthenes, our brother. Now, some have speculated this could be the Sosthenes that got beat up back in Acts chapter 18. It could very well be. It was a common name, but we don't know. However, it was evident that he was well known among the Corinthians, so it's kind of leans heavily towards the side that it probably was Sosthenes that got beat up. I mean, think about it. Paul got thrown out. The Greeks beat up the chief ruler of the synagogue and left him there on the street. Who do you think was the first one that went up to him? I think Paul and what was the other one's name? No, the other chief ruler of the synagogue. Crispus. Went up to him and probably took care of him and taught him the gospel, and he probably, with his knowledge, was converted. I'm kind of thinking that may have happened. We don't know. Sometimes I like to speculate. Sometimes I'll throw these things out there because it kind of gives us an idea of maybe the Hollywood version of what we may see here, and kind of helps us understand why these events happened, why they did. So anyway, Paul was a writer, and Sosthenes, our brother, was with him. And we'll talk about sanctification of these people starting in verse 2 next Wednesday night. Thank you for your time and your comments. Oh, by the way, I may not get to the answers in this book all the time, but if you click on the little square thing, I'll try to have what I think are the correct answers to the questions at the end of those notes. So I'm probably going to do a lot of copyright violations of Harkwriter, but if he wants to take me to court, then we'll deal with that down the road. But, and if anybody would like this book is also available as a PDF or an EPUB, so if you would rather that than the paper copy, let me know and we'll make arrangements for that. Thank you for your time.